Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., and to our World Affairs Today program with Dr. Trita Parsi. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the Council, and it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to the discussion of U.S. relations with Iran. Are we headed for war? That question seems to come up a lot these days. Hardly a day goes by without some related headline. Tehran decides to enrich uranium at the new underground facility. Iran threatens to close the straits. Yet another Iranian scientist is assassinated. The U.S. calls for stricter sanctions. 2 days ago, the U.S. sent the USS Abraham Lincoln and its battle group sailing into the Gulf in a lead-up to joint U.S.-Israeli war games off Iran's coast. To some, if not many, it is a rhetorical sequence not unlike that which led to the U.S. invasion of Iraq 10 years ago. So, where is it all going? Tonight we have as our guest Dr. Trita Parsi. Dr. Parsi is founder and president of the National Iranian American Council, as well as an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He is no stranger to the World Affairs Council. We have hosted him previously to discuss his award-winning book, Treacherous Alliance: The Secret Dealings of Iran, Israel, and the United States. And he has participated in the Council's annual Summer Institute on International Affairs for high school teachers this past summer, presenting a riveting account of U.S.-Iranian relations in the context of the Arab Spring and U.S. relations with the region. He joins us to discuss his recently published work, A Single Roll of the Dice: Obama's Diplomacy with Iran. Trita was born in Iran, leaving with his family at age 4, first to Sweden and then to the United States. He received his PhD from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He is a frequent consultant to Western and Asian governments, and his articles routinely appear in all the major news outlets and publications. He is also a frequent guest on CNN, PBS, NewsHour, NPR, the BBC, and Al Jazeera, among others. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Trita Parsi.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to come back to the World Affairs Council, and a special thank you to Heidi and to Bill for having invited me to be here today. Rarely has it happened that I've been invited to come and talk about a jolly subject with a very positive outlook. I didn't expect anything less this time either. So if it's repetitive in its pessimism about the situation, please don't blame me on this. I'm here to talk to you about my new book, A Single Roll of the Dice. The official publication date is actually today, but it's been out in the stores for about 2 or so weeks. It's based on approximately 60 interviews with all of the major players in all of the major countries that have been involved in this, including, of course, people from the Obama administration, some of the Iranian negotiators, representatives of the Israeli, Saudi, European governments, but also Turkey and Brazil, and I'll explain a little bit later why they have actually played a very important role in all of this. So without any further ado, let me get to the very heart of the subject. I'm going to start off with a quote from President Obama himself. To the Muslim world, we seek a new way forward, based on mutual interest and mutual respect. To those who cling to power through corruption and deceit and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history, but that we will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your fist. Only 12 and a half minutes into Obama's presidency, Obama reached out to the decision makers in Tehran, offering America's hand of friendship if they would unclench their fists. This was a bold move, but not one born out of desire, but rather necessity. To the best of our knowledge, Obama did not have a secret childhood dream about negotiating with the autocratic rulers of Tehran, but rather because of the developments in the 8 years preceding him and the many mistakes of the Bush administration, some form of engagement with the Iranians had essentially ended up becoming a strategic necessity for the United States. The Bush administration pursued an ideological foreign policy. One of its tenets was that talking to your enemies would strengthen them, that you only reserved dialogue and diplomacy to the countries that deserved America's friendship. And since the United States essentially was the ultimate source of legitimacy in the international arena, you did not want to engage with an enemy and run the risk of legitimizing their government. Whatever one's view is of that ideological outlook on foreign policy, the track record of it is quite clear. During the 8 years that the Bush administration did not engage in any direct, sustainable diplomacy with the Iranians, Iran ended up becoming an increasingly influential player in the Middle East. After having first had major enemies in the governments of Iraq and Afghanistan, now Iran was the kingmaker of the political order in those two countries. It probably had no more than 50 or so centrifuges at the early years of the Bush administration. By the time Bush left the White House, Iran had approximately 8,000 centrifuges. So the track record was quite clear, and an unprecedented political climate had been created in the United States in which suddenly it was a possibility for a political actor to go out and make the promise of diplomacy with an enemy of the United States part of your presidential platform. And for Obama, talking to Tehran became the poster child of this platform. Now, this became a successful card, which was very surprising, mindful of the fact that talking to the Iranians had essentially been a taboo for many years in the US. But that was viewed largely as a rejection of the ideology that underlied the Bush administration's foreign policy. But as the Obama administration entered the White House, they knew very well that this unprecedented opening in the political atmosphere would be a limited one, and it would not last forever. Time would be short. Some sort of an agreement or some sort of a breakthrough needed to come during the first 12 or so months of the administration's term in order for it to be, in order for additional political space to be created. And there was so much pressure on the administration against pursuing diplomacy, not necessarily from the American public, but there was pressure from Israel, Saudi Arabia, two countries that were very fearful that in a negotiation, the United States would strike a deal that essentially would accept Iran's ascendancy in the region and would bring about strategic problems for Israel and for Saudi Arabia. While there was a lot of enthusiasm in many capitals in Europe, there were also a lot of apprehension in some European capitals, particularly in Paris, in which there was a fear that Obama would be so inclined to get a deal on the nuclear issue that he would be willing to rewrite and redefine the Western red lines on this issue. And there was a fear that the deal would come at the expense of a larger non-proliferation objective. And overshadowing all of this, of course, was the fear hanging over Obama's head throughout this period and still today, that perhaps patience in Israel would run out, and at some point the Israelis would take preemptive or preventive military action against Iran, leading to a third major war in the region, a war that the US military towards the end of the Bush administration had made very clear they did not want. Until this day, if you listen carefully to what the US military is saying, it's quite clear it's not the US military pushing towards some form of a military confrontation with the Iranians. Of all of America's key allies, many of them wished Obama well, very few of them wished him success. That was the starting point for his diplomacy with Iran. And after 30 years of mutual demonization, in which both sides had essentially defined the other as the worst possible entity, the Iranians consistently, until this day, refer to the United States as the Great Satan. Bush put Iran into the axis of evil. After that, you need to do something about the atmospherics first in order to have a situation in which diplomacy even can have a chance. You cannot start negotiations under those circumstances. The first thing the Obama administration did was they put together a committee to review the policy and come up with a new policy option. In the meantime, they started changing the vocabulary of how the United States referred to Iran, how it addressed Iran, taking out a lot of the much more hostile language, not because that in and of itself would resolve the issue, but just to create the atmospherics that could be conducive to the success of diplomacy. The most stark example of that was how Obama taped an unprecedented message, both to the Iranian people and the Iranian government on the eve of the Iranian New Year in 2009, in March 2009. In that 3.5-minute message, he addressed both the people and the government, and he expressed his desire for a better relationship between the United States and Iran. He made clear that the many problems between the two countries could not be resolved through threats, which was a clear departure from the approach of the Bush administration. He referred to Iran to its formal name, which is Islamic Republic, which was an aim to signal to the Iranians that his administration was not seeking regime change any longer. And he also referred to the idea that Iran needs to be brought back into the family of nations, which was an indication of how far the engagement could go, that at the end of this process, the idea was to bring Iran out of its isolation. The Iranian response was very swift. Within a day, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, gave a speech in his hometown of Mashhad, in which he spent the first 40 minutes just blasting the United States and listing all of the crimes that the US had committed against Iran from the Iranian perspective over the course of the last half century or so. But towards the end of the speech, he said a few things that left a little bit of an opening. He did express a lot of doubt as to whether Obama really could turn around the American policy on Iran, saying we don't know who is in charge in the United States. Is it the president? Is it Congress? Or are there other forces in the shadows? He also said that they don't have any major experience with this new administration. So if you change, we will change, Khamenei said, which essentially became the motto of the Iranian government in dealing with Obama, saying, change in rhetoric is not enough. Convince us that there is a change in substance. But it was packaged in an otherwise rather hostile reaction to Obama's message. But the Obama administration, about a month or so after the speech, had been ready with its policy review and it was ready to start negotiations. But then they lost another 2 months, very valuable months, because Iran was now going into its political season. On June 12th, 2009, they had elections in Iran, presidential elections, which ended up being very heated. Prior to that, the administration was trying to figure out, should they talk to the Iranians beforehand or should they wait till afterwards? And the end conclusion was that it was probably better to wait. They didn't want to do anything that inadvertently could affect the outcome of the elections in the wrong direction. But what they expected was that by June 13th, the day after the elections, there would be some political clarity in Iran, and they would know who they have to deal with, and soon thereafter, hopefully, they could get on with diplomacy and actually address the many issues standing between the United States and Iran. What they did not expect was that the elections would be so fraudulent and that they would be followed by mass protests by the population who would desire that their votes would be counted, massive human rights abuses taking place in front of the world's cameras, and a political war inside the elite of Iran, which completely paralyzed not only the country, but certainly its foreign policy establishment. Iran was in no position to be able to negotiate. And this also became the first and biggest blow to the administration's moral confidence of going forward with negotiations. Already there was some hesitation, there was no naivete about the difficulties and the human rights violations that the Iranian government systematically engages in. But to have it out there in the manner that it was made it very difficult for the administration. But something that had happened just about a week before the elections that had given the administration significant hope that there was promise for diplomacy and that there was an effective way of starting it. And that was that on June 2nd, 2009, the Iranians sent a letter to El-Baradei, the head of the atomic energy, the IAEA in Geneva, saying that Iran had run out of fuel for its Tehran research reactor, a 40 or so year old reactor that was given to the Iranians by the United States during the time of the Shah, which the Iranians used to produce medical isotopes for about 850 or 900,000 medical patients in Iran. The Iranians wanted to buy fuel rods for this reactor, and they said that they wanted El-Baradei to contact all potential sellers on the market and inform them of this desire. El-Baradei, however, did not do that. He realized the opportunity and only informed the Russians and the United States. Why? Because there had been conversations before from the early stages of the Obama administration in which Obama had been trying to figure out how can we reduce the breakout capability of the Iranians. Because if that is reduced, there would be more time and space for diplomacy, and we would have greater maneuverability to address the many difficulties between the two countries. But as long as Iran was enriching uranium and stockpiling low-enriched uranium, which then can be used to produce higher-enriched uranium, which can be used to build nuclear weapons, there was a fear that as long as the Iranians had sufficient LEU, low-enriched uranium, for a bomb, there would be significant pressure on the administration to turn towards a military option. Now, with the Iranians actually asking for fuel pads, there was an opportunity, because one could use Iran's own low-enriched uranium to produce the fuel pads, and that way, not only would the Iranians get the fuel pads that they wanted, the West would be much more comfortable because the LEU count would be significantly reduced. The White House had already been sitting and trying to figure out what kind of a deal could be offered to the Iranians in which the Iranians would be willing to give up their LEU. Now suddenly they had their opening. The Iranians themselves had desired to buy fuel pads. The difficulty, of course, was that the election scandal came and all of the human rights abuses and the lack of political clarity. Can the Iranian government even negotiate? By mid-September, however, there was a decision that there's going to be pressure on the Iranians to come to the table. There was a risk, a calculated risk. The administration knew that the circumstances were not good, but there was no clear indication of how long the administration could wait before the political infighting in Iran would end. It might take another year or so, and the administration didn't have the time to wait. Moreover, there was a calculation that perhaps precisely because of the weakness of the Iranian government, the US could translate that into a strength for itself and get a better deal. By October 1st, for the first time, talks were held between the P5+1, the permanent members of the Security Council, and Germany with the Iranians. And for the first time, did the US now participate actively in the conversations. And the deal, the contours of the deal, was put forward to the Iranians. Surprisingly, the response was quite positive. And there was an agreement to meet shortly thereafter to hash out the details of the deal. Those negotiations at the technical level were held on October 19 in Vienna. And there, all the problems began. Because the United States puts forward a proposal, which actually had been adopted by the IAEA, so it was referred to as the El-Baradei proposal, in which they say the Iranians need to give up 1,200 kilos of low-enriched uranium in one shipment to be sent to Russia, to be re-enriched, and after that sent to France, where the fuel pads would be produced, and sent back to Iran about a year later. And the Iranians essentially said, we didn't agree to this. Because this would mean that the 1,200 kilo would leave Iran in one shipment, but the Iranians would have to wait a full 12 months before they got the transaction back to them, and they felt that this would maximize all the risk on their end, whereas the West would not take that much of a risk. There was no guarantee, the Iranians argued, that the French would not renege on the deal, and suddenly Iran's strategic asset would be sitting in France, and the Iranians couldn't do anything about it. So the negotiations essentially were centered around this, and there was no solution to this by the third day. From the US perspective, dividing the 1,200 kilo into 3 batches, as the Iranians suggested, was a non-starter, both because of a technical aspect, but also because the entire idea was to get the Iranian LEU count down as low as possible so they would be as far away as possible from a breakout capability. If only 400 kilos was sent out of Iran's 1,500 kilos at the time, Iran would arguably still have enough LEU to be able to produce a bomb. So that was not an option for the United States. By the third day, El-Baradei realized that this was coming to a fiasco, essentially. But instead of announcing that, there was a gentleman's agreement between the negotiators saying, instead of saying that we failed, let's take this back to the respective capitals, and let's think about it for 3 days and then give a written response to the IEA whether the proposal of the IEA is accepted or not. All of the other countries, Russia, France, the United States, essentially accepted their own proposal. That wasn't too tricky to do. The Iranians ended up neither saying yes or no. They asked for more time, they asked for another meeting, and it started to become apparent in Washington that diplomacy essentially had not succeeded in getting that quick breakthrough that Obama felt was needed. And there was now more pressure that we had to abandon the diplomacy track and move towards sanctions, and that potentially all the talk about military strikes would once again begin. By end of November, only about a month afterwards, Obama essentially approves the activation of the pressure track. Instead of diplomacy, we were now going to go to the Security Council in New York and try to get a very, very harsh UN Security Council sanction on the Iranians to punish them, to pressure them for not having agreed to the deal, and hopefully soften their position so that they would come back to the table with a yes. The expectation at first was that by February or so, when France was chairing the presidency of the Security Council, an agreement would be found, and we could quickly move forward with that. There was a lot of pressure from Congress on the administration at the moment to get sanctions adopted. Congress was arguing that Congress could pass its own sanctions. There was no need for waiting for the Security Council. But the Obama administration felt that if congressional sanctions come first, you will create a crisis within the P5+1, and the Iranians would then be able to take advantage of the lack of unity within the P5. So it's better to have the multilateral sanctions through the UN first. But it didn't end up being as simple as the Obama administration expected. There was significant resistance from the Russians and from the Chinese. They were not in agreement that diplomacy necessarily had been exhausted, and time started passing, and Congress was getting anxious, and the Obama administration was getting nervous. They had nothing to show for their diplomacy. They had made a big gamble about talking to the Iranians, and now the argument from the hawkish side was a year and a half has been lost, nothing has come out of this. The Iranians have been able to continue with their program, they're advancing it, their LEU count is growing. Then by May, it started to appear that something was in the making. Then something happened that the Obama administration did not expect. 2 countries in the Security Council that have a stake in this issue decided to embark on their own mediation effort to try to find a solution to get diplomacy back on track. Those 2 countries were Turkey and Brazil. Both of them had various reasons to be involved in this, but by coincidence, they were now at the same time in the Security Council and had a formal say in this issue. They began negotiating with the encouragement of the Obama administration early on to try to see if they could convince the Iranians to say yes to the deal. After some preparations for the negotiations, on May 16th, 2010, President Lula of Brazil arrives in Tehran. A day later, Erdogan from Turkey comes there, and they begin marathon negotiations lasting 18 hours between the Iranians, the Brazilians, and the Turks to try to get the Iranians to agree to a variation of this deal. Expectation in Washington was, of course, that they would fail, and once they had failed, Turkey and Brazil would satisfy themselves and join the sanctions chorus, 2 countries that otherwise, in principle, tended to be very negative towards sanctions. Lo and behold, they succeeded. They got Iran to say yes and put their signature on a deal that in essence followed the benchmarks of the original deal from October 2009. 1,200 kilos of Iranian LEU was shipped out in one shipment. A year or so later, the Iranians would get their fuel pads. The added twist to it was that the Iranian LEU would not be used to produce the fuel pads. The Iranian LEU would be put in an escrow in Turkey, and if the West reneged on the deal, the Iranians could get the LEU back. And that way, that was a mechanism to make sure that neither side had any incentives to cheat on the other. It was actually a mechanism that Lula and Erdogan discussed with Obama on April 13th during the Zero Summit here in Washington, D.C., in which Obama himself said that this is a good solution. What the Turks and the Brazilians did not know, though, was that a day before Lula arrived in Tehran, China and Russia had sent their yes to the United States and agreed on a sanctions draft. So now the Obama administration was faced, on the one hand, a deal that in many parts was essentially based on the same principles and benchmarks as the deal only 6 months earlier, or sanctions in the Security Council to punish Iran for not having said yes in the first place. The response of the Obama administration was swift. There wasn't any real reflection on accepting the Turkish-Brazilian deal. It was rejected up front, shocking the Brazilians and the Turks. And the Obama administration came out and said, this deal has expired because now the Iranians are enriching uranium to 20%, and this deal does not address that. Moreover, the Iranians had 1,500 kilos of LEU in October 2009. Now, in May 2010, they had 2,400 kilos. If you take out 1,200 kilos, the Iranians still have 1,200 kilos left. So it doesn't do what the Obama administration wanted. And on Tuesday, after the Sunday when the deal was brokered, Secretary Clinton is in the Senate testifying, and in that testimony she says that this afternoon we will circulate an approved draft for sanctions in the Security Council, and essentially announced that sanctions had been approved by all of the P5 members, which is essentially what is needed for it to pass. And then she said, this is the clearest answer we can give to the developments of this past weekend, referring to the essentially successful mediation effort by Turkey and Brazil. What Clinton might not have known, but what was not out in the public media, was that only 3 weeks earlier, on April 20th, Obama had sent a letter to Lula and to Erdogan saying, getting 1,200 kilos of LEU out of Iran would be a significant confidence-building measure and would be of tremendous importance to U.S. national security. The letter did not say, get more than 1,200 kilos. The letter did not even mention the fact that Iran was now producing enrichment at 20% as a deal breaker. In fact, the letter also endorsed the idea of putting it in escrow in Turkey as an acceptable compromise. Someone in Lula's office leaked the letter to the Brazilian media, and within a couple of hours, it was all over the US media, and it became quite an embarrassment for the Obama administration. So why did the Obama administration reject this deal? The bottom line, I think, is this. First of all, when you make such an investment in getting so many different countries to agree on a punitive measure such as sanctions, you put in a huge amount of political capital. And even if, in your mind, this is made in order to convince the Iranians to agree to your deal, sometimes the success of getting other countries to agree to the sanctions becomes so overjoyous. The lure of the sanctions is so great that you actually lose sight of what is the actual purpose here. Is it the threat of sanctions to get the Iranians to agree, or is it the imposition of sanctions for the sake of sanctions? But beyond that, the deal, from the Obama administration's perspective, if they had accepted the deal and gone forward with this compromise, Congress would nevertheless have moved forward with their own sanctions against Iran, which would have targeted other countries as well. Most of the sanctions that Congress currently passed on Iran are extraterritorial. They're actually targeting other countries. We don't have any trade left with Iran, so we're targeting the countries that do have trade with Iran, including P5 states. And you would have a complete deterioration of the consensus and the unity of the P5+1 against Iran. And the Iranians, the argument was, would be able to use that against the United States. Passing sanctions essentially had become the organizing principle for alliance management within the P5+1. more so than the importance of making sure that we could achieve our non-proliferation objectives. The administration had run out of political space. They felt that they had no political capital left that they could spend 6 months before congressional elections in convincing Congress not to pass the sanctions. So they had to pass the Security Council sanctions in order to minimize the damage of the congressional sanctions. But in essence, it meant that between a nuclear breakthrough and sanctions, we ended up choosing sanctions. And now we are here, 12 or so months later, and we see that the deadlock is as locked as it ever has been. We have moved closer to the risk of a military confrontation, and there is a perception that, that diplomacy essentially has been exhausted. Whereas in reality, as one Obama administration official expressed it to me, which became the title of the book, our diplomacy with Iran became a gamble on a single roll of the dice. It either had to work immediately or not at all. The administration did not feel that it had the political space to sustain this effort. They needed a quick breakthrough, and they didn't get one. The same problem exists on the Iranian side. Neither side have shown the type of political will, political patience to actually overcome 30 years of enmity, because the risk-taking, the willingness to take risk for peacemaking, unfortunately, is less on both sides compared to the willingness to accept risk for confrontation. And as long as that is the case, I fear that we're going to continue to see far more clenched fists rather than open hands between the United States and Iran. I'll stop there. Thank you. Open for questions.
When the election campaign was going on before 2008 election, there was a distinct difference between President Obama and Secretary Clinton at that time, candidate Clinton. And the difference was that while Secretary Clinton was talking about obliteration of Iran in case that they achieved any type of nuclear potential or deterrence, in a sense, President Obama was championing his foreign policy on negotiation. After the election, he basically handed out the foreign policy to the same person. She appointed Dennis Ross as her major or chief advisor, and now I guess all the balls are filled with the secretary.
I don't want to get into any speculation and pin it on any one individual, but I think one thing still stands out today when you talk to people at the White House, which is that the person in the White House that is still most optimistic or most willing to pursue diplomacy remains Obama. And that was the case from the very beginning, which means that the bureaucracy, as well as many of the folks that were put into the administration, did not share necessarily I wouldn't say the desire, but that had the same patience and willingness to go that extra mile for it. In fact, when you read some of the WikiLeaks documents, and I went through all of them, and all of them that had anything to do with this issue, you saw that already in March 2009, in a briefing to the Europeans about what Obama's policy was, the person briefing, which was a pretty senior person, said that we don't believe this is going to work. We're going to try it, but we don't believe it's going to work. And that may just have been an honest assessment. We're going to try it, we don't believe it's going to work. I personally don't believe, however, that that was the view of Obama. I think his view was that he's going to try to make it work and that he believed in it. But not the rest of the bureaucracy and many of the important people that he appointed did not seem to share the strength of Obama in that view. And ultimately, that does create a problem. Because in order to succeed with any diplomatic effort, and I spoke to some of the folks in this room who actually played a heroic role in previous negotiations that the US have succeeded with, you have to have enough strength, enough coherence to overcome the last hurdle on the road. In the case of the US and Iran, it failed at the first hurdle. We didn't have the political will to overcome that. And I think part of the explanation for that is exactly that the president was the person who believed most in this and others believed less in it. And you have to have a strong team that reinforces the beliefs and creates that energy to go that last mile. Even in that case, we have to be clear, it might not have worked. But I would make the argument, based on what has happened in the last 3 years, diplomacy, sustainable, patient diplomacy, is still an untested proposition. If you compare it to, for instance, some of the other negotiations that the US has had with countries that were enemies of the US, it took 4 years of negotiations between the United States and Vietnam to normalize relations between 1990 and 1994. Another 6 years to get a full trade agreement. All of this happened over the course of 3 presidencies. Negotiations with Libya to get them to capitulate their nuclear program took exactly 7 years. And during that period, there were long periods of time in which there were no talks at all because they broke down, but they were restarted. The Good Friday Agreement that Senator Mitchell negotiated in Northern Ireland, there's a very interesting quote that he gave to Charlie Rose. He said, for 700 days, both sides told me they would not agree to anything the other side would agree on. On the 701st day, they both changed their minds. Luckily for us, Senator Mitchell did not give up for those 700 days. He stuck with it and eventually got a deal. Any diplomacy with Iran to be successful needs to have the same sustainability, not only over here, but also over Iran. We should not forget that they have very similar problems. Anything less than that is an attempt, is a single roll of the dice, but it's not an exhaustion of diplomacy.
As we approach a possible confrontation with Iran, shouldn't we be paying some attention to the horrendous civilian casualties that would result? We seem to be indifferent to that in other wars, and recently a Marine got 3 months for his part in the killing of 24 Iraqi civilians. And we are not thinking in terms of the effect on the population of Iran and the collateral damage that it would take. And that, I think, should be a major deterrent toward to pushing toward further military confrontation.
I would wholeheartedly agree with you. Wars are not video games, and we should not treat them as such. And I think we should also remember that even if we take a look at this from a more selfish perspective, we have a population in Iran that, at least up until recently and hopefully in the future, will have a quite positive outlook on the United States, a positive view of American values, of American culture, of Americans, even though they may strongly disagree with American foreign policy. That is quite a rarity in the Middle East, unfortunately. Even some of the countries that have the strongest relations with the US government, for instance, polls show that in the mid-2000s, support or approval ratings of the United States in Turkey was about 11%, a very strong US ally. 9% in Indonesia, one of the most populous Muslim states. But in Iran, although I haven't seen clear polls, and I would suspect that it would be much, much higher. At the first bullet, the first boot on the ground, that strategic asset, that long-term strategic asset, that thing that is called winning the hearts of minds, which in Iran we don't have to do, we just have to make sure we don't lose them, is going to be lost.
Can you go into more detail about the role Saudi Arabia plays in all this? And since they are their strategic competitor and religious rival?
Absolutely. When you take a look at this institutionalized enmity, we have to remember that the benefactors of the continuation of the status quo are not just, the bureaucracies or political careers. Plenty of states in the region have established their own strategic calculations, their businesses, and much else on the continuation of this. And on the Saudi side, because there has been a historic rivalry, because there's a fear that if the US and Iran make up, Iran is going to become a key ally of the United States in the region, and we're going to go back to the times of the Shah when Iran was essentially the pillar of American security in the region, and the Saudis were playing a secondary role, and they're very afraid of what they call Persian hegemony in the region. Talking to people in the US military, in fact, Bob Gates himself said that there's an exaggerated view in some of these states about how cozy the US and Iran can get. Even in successful negotiations, at best, it would probably be a significant reduction of tensions, but would still be quite far away from anything resembling an alliance. But those fears have been really driving a lot of the policies of the Saudis and other states in the Arab side of the Persian Gulf, being very nervous about what diplomacy actually could mean. I don't think there has been as strong of a desire for military operations. There's been some. I don't know if it's coherent in the government. One Arab official put it this way, that The United States and Iran are two big elephants. The Arabs are the grass. Whether the elephants make love or go to war, the grass still gets crushed. So the status quo of keeping neither a war nor a peace is more preferable than an outright war or an outright marriage between the United States and Iran. But I would tend to agree with Bob Gates. It's a highly exaggerated view, thinking that the United States would turn the Islamic Republic, particularly this current composition of the Iranian government, into an ally. I find that highly unlikely. There are strategic common interests, there are tactical common interests that could be exploited, but an alliance I frankly don't think is actually desired, neither by the United States nor by the Iranians.
Why do you think that Russia and China agreed to sanctions right when they did? And do you think that Obama could have used the promise of those sanctions to create more political wiggle room and pursue that deal with the sanctions as a background threat in case the Iranians tried to pull out again?
I think it's an excellent question. It's actually a point that I forgot to mention. In order to get the Chinese and the Russians to agree to a sanctions deal, a lot of other deals were made with these countries, particularly with the Chinese. Everything from START 2 to the missile shield, etc. And all of those deals essentially hinged on sanctions being passed. So if sanctions weren't passed, there was a question mark. What would happen to those other deals? The U.S. had made some significant concessions to the Russians on those, which shows that at the end of the day, particularly when it came to the haggling in the Security Council of what would be in or outside of the sanctions, all of the different exemptions that the Russians and to a certain extent Chinese got, had really nothing to do with non-proliferation. One diplomat who's not part of the P5 said, it's quite astonishing that in what was supposed to be non-proliferation-oriented Security Council resolution, there's an exemption that enabled Russia to continue to build a nuclear reactor in Bushehr in Iran, but other states could not continue to sell or do transactions, financial transactions, etc., on things that had nothing to do with the nuclear issue. And this is actually part of the reason why there was a desire by some of the non-P5 states to go that extra length to find a solution, because they felt that the deal took into account the interest of all of the major powers, but none of the other states in the Security Council as a whole.
You haven't mentioned Syria. If Assad falls, so does Iran's influence in Lebanon, so does Iran's influence with Hezbollah and Hamas. Because right now, they're the agents of Iran in the Middle East.
I don't share your assessment that if Assad would fall, all of these other things would follow. I think if Assad would fall, that would be a significant blow to the current Iranian government. It would have a very negative impact on their ability to project influence in some of those areas. But it's not as essential in the way that you described it. Iran's influence in Lebanon is not based on Assad's survival, for instance. And I think we should also remember one thing. We're no longer in the Cold War, in which if a communist country fell, it would clearly, very black and white, be a positive for the United States and a negative for the Soviet Union. We're now in a multipolar system in the region. When one of these governments fall, it's very unclear who the main benefactors are. It may be a little bit more clear who would be the biggest loser. I think if Syria falls, Iran will be the biggest loser. Will that translate into an equally sizable benefit for the United States? I doubt it. Just see what happened in Egypt. A lot of people in the US were extremely fearful that the fall of the ultimately, and perhaps in the views of some Egyptians, excessively pro-American Mubarak did not translate into an automatic win for the Iranians. In fact, the US influence in Egypt is still quite significant. The spoils are going to be shared in an unpredictable way. And in fact, the most likely scenario in Syria is not that Assad falls and you will have a very strong pro-American or pro-Turkish government. You're probably going to have a civil war in which the Iranians will continue to have influence, not to the same extent that they do right now, but they would still have it. As to the way that you phrased the question, I thought was very interesting, because I think you're right. The Iranians are in alliance with Hezbollah that has had very negative effects on matters in the region from the American perspective as well as from the Israeli and other perspectives. But what you're doing in essence is restating the problem. Diplomacy is not aimed at ensuring that that continues. Nor is it aimed at accepting or blessing that this is happening. It's precisely because of what you said that diplomacy is needed in order to resolve it, in order to get to a different situation. And I think we need to remind ourselves from that, because if we just list all of the negative things that the Iranians are doing, and the Iranians did the same thing when Khamenei was responding to Obama, all we get is a restatement of the problem, which then will reduce our willingness to do anything beyond perpetuating the problem.
Do you think as we get closer to the elections that there will be more pressure of the forces in favor of military action? And if Mr. Obama gets to a second term without war, there will be more of an opening with for diplomacy?
I think the real risky period is now till the elections. I think this is the time in which there's a lot of nervousness in the White House, for instance, that perhaps the Israelis would take preemptive or preventive military action, which the U.S. views having very negative impact on the region as a whole. But the political cost for the Israelis to take that action right now is far less in the midst of a campaign, an election season, than it would be, for instance, in a year from now. So there is a significant concern. I think this is the period in which we have to have very, very humble expectations. I don't foresee any significant breakthroughs. I think the chances of that are very limited. What needs to be done under these circumstances is just to manage the conflict and ensure there's no further escalation. If we can ride out the next 12 to 15 months past the US election and past the Iranian elections in 2013, then perhaps there will be an opportunity to create greater political space for something more constructive. Now, I don't believe the Obama administration has completely given up. I think they're serious about getting some form of a talk with the Iranians in the next couple of weeks. Some were talking about January 28th, perhaps even. That's not going to happen that soon. But we also have to be honest, because of the elections in the United States, because of the parliamentary elections early in March in Iran, the likelihood of the two sides having flexibility to actually do a compromise that they can defend and stand for is very, very limited. But perhaps they can do something to just reduce the volume, the tensions, and keep it that way for a couple of months. That in and of itself would be quite helpful.
What do you think could be the role of Europeans, if any, in future scenarios and negotiation? Should we assume, with the emergence of Turkey and Brazil as alternative players, that the window of opportunity that was open for the Europeans in 2003, 2004 is closed? And in this case, who should we blame for this closure of the window of opportunity? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think it's too constructive to necessarily going into the blame game of saying who's to blame for what. But I do have to still say that I think Europe's role in this has reached some sort of an expiration date. Not to say that Europe can be completely set aside, but there is far greater diplomacy fatigue, negotiation fatigue in Europe than I think it is currently in the Obama administration. You have a harsher position, much harsher position, in the French government on the nuclear issue than you do in the Obama administration. Now, at times, this actually was a problem for the Obama administration. To be able to move forward, there would be a need to have more support from the allies on this issue. But the French have a very principled position. They're very concerned that these type of fuel swaps will actually legitimize Iranian enrichment. The French have a very strong principled position in which they reject the concept that there is a right to enrichment, and they reject any deals that would make any reference to that. And I think the French actually have a position right now, and the Brits as well, that is more close to the Bush administration's zero enrichment objective than the Obama administration does right now. And when you talk to people in the Obama administration, they make very clear if the Obama administration or the US or the West were in such a position of strength that they could dictate the terms of Iran's capitulation, then fine. Zero enrichment would be perhaps the best solution. But that is just simply not reality. So what do you do in a reality in which you're not in complete control, when you have to compromise? So I think actually the EU3's position, or at least France and Britain's, have created some difficulties for the Obama administration. It's not good for a US president to look weaker than the French, if you're very sensitive to those optics. But also, I think it's very clear that that position held by the French and the Brits is not necessarily shared by a lot of other EU countries. We oftentimes refer to this to the EU position, but it is primarily determined by France, Britain, and Germany rather than a collective decision-making. Not to say that other countries don't have a say in it, but they're not the drivers of this. I don't foresee any solution in which Europe is completely sidelined, but I'm skeptical about the mechanism for negotiations that we have right now within the P5+1 in Iran. Not to say that that can be wished away or sidelined, but perhaps it can be complemented. Because within the P5+1 and Iran, none of the countries there really trust Iran. Iran doesn't trust any of those countries, and that's not a particularly strong starting point for a successful negotiation. Other countries can, as I mentioned earlier on, inject some modicum of trust if they could act, or if they can be participatory in this. But there's a significant fear that if you expand the group or if you add other components to it, the US or others could lose control of the process. And that's not something that the administration is taking lightly.
Do you envision that, you know, there might come a time when the, you know, Iran and the US arrive at a point where they just basically accept that maybe Iran is just going to go ahead with this, whatever it is that everybody's afraid of, and maybe the world can live with it? Because there are other countries that have nuclear, you know, Israel has it. And so do you think maybe there could be a regime where Iran would have it and the world could tolerate it? And as a kind of connected to this question, I'm really still wondering what Israel is so afraid of. Because, you know, Ahmadinejad goes around and says certain things, but, you know, how do you see this, you know, Iran's policy toward Israel, and, you know, what's really going on within the Iranian government, the fear? Because I don't understand it. I'm from Iran.
Thank you. Thank you so much. On the first issue, if we just separate some of these components, can the world eventually live with a nuclear Iran? And I don't know if you're referring to a nuclear-capable Iran or if it's a Iran that actually has the bomb. I don't think it is Armageddon. I don't think it's a good situation. I think it would be very bad. I think you would see the risk of proliferation in the region increase. You would have more states with even less diplomacy and connectivity between them having the weapon. Those countries that have the weapon are quite honest about how difficult it is to actually handle them. It's not an easy thing. You need to have very elaborate communication system just to make sure that there's no misunderstandings. And between the Soviet Union and the United States, there were instances in which, you know, an accident could have happened. So I don't think it would be a good thing. And I think we're far, far away from a situation in which there would have to be an acceptance of this type of a fait accompli. The Iranians are not having a nuclear bomb right now. We have to deconstruct some of the hysteria that exists around this issue. They don't have a nuclear bomb right now. According to Penera, they've not made a decision to build a nuclear bomb. There's various estimates of if they were to make that decision, how long it would take. There's a comfort level in the White House right now that if they were to try to break out, if they configure the way that they have assembled the cascades of centrifuges and they started to do much higher level enrichment, that IAEA would find out within 30 to 60 days, which is a shorter time period than Iran would actually need to build the bomb, so the world could react. All of the LEU that Iran currently has is under supervision of the IAEA and is accounted for, so we haven't seen any divergence of that. But that doesn't mean, so I think it's important to remind ourselves of that, because sometimes the level of hysteria in the conversation gets us to a point in which we think that they're going to have a bomb tomorrow and my God, it's going to be the end of the world. But I think also it's important to be honest, it's not a positive development to have any more countries, particularly countries that really don't have good relations with almost anyone, have a nuclear weapon. It's not a good thing. So I think it's quite fair, I think it's quite appropriate to do something about it. That doesn't mean, however, that the approach, at least in my assessment, has been the most effective, that it has been based on the correct assumptions, that it's been executed the best possible way. As to the other issue about Iran and Israel actually have a much longer and more interesting history than what we know of ever since Ahmadinejad started to reuse some of the very harsh language and venomous rhetoric against Israel. Back in the 1960s and 70s, they were close allies. Back in the 1980s, in spite of the Islamic Republic and its very, very aggressive rhetoric against Israel, Israel was the country in Washington, D.C. that was lobbying Washington to talk to Iran, to sell arms to Iran, and not to pay attention to Iranian rhetoric because the rhetoric was not reflective of policy. That was because it was a different geopolitical circumstance at the time. Iran and Israel shared a common threat in Saddam Hussein, in other Arab states, in the penetration of the Soviet Union in the Middle East, a strategic foundation that actually given birth to an alliance between them during the time of the Shah. Those circumstances ceased to exist in the 1990s, and it's actually at that point in which you start hearing an Israeli rhetoric about Iran being a global threat, a language that the Israelis were not using back in the 1980s when Iran's revolutionary zeal actually was much, much greater. But at the same time, even though I think we should take some of the Israeli rhetoric with a pinch of salt, I just came back from Israel about a week and a half ago and had interesting conversations there with decision makers. I think we also have to recognize that some of the rhetoric, particularly in relation to the Holocaust, is striking a very, very sensitive nerve. It's certainly not helping the situation. If we recognize what Obama did by trying to tone down the rhetoric, we also have to recognize how immensely unhelpful it has been by the Iranian government, and Ahmadinejad in particular, to increase the volume in the manner that he has, even though some of the things he said has been mistranslated. And it's not leading to a better situation in any way, shape, or form. And it's also making it much, much easier for those who find the political benefit in further perpetuating the atmosphere of hysteria by pointing to the Iranian rhetoric. But ultimately, though, what the Israelis are afraid of when it comes to an Iranian nuclear capability or an Iranian nuclear bomb is not that the Iranians actually would use it. One advisor to Sharon made it very clear to me, saying that whatever Iran does to destroy Israel, they cannot destroy Israel's ability to destroy Iran in turn. Meaning that Israel has a second strike capability. Even if the Iranians were to strike Israel with a nuclear bomb, that second strike capability is sitting on Dolphin submarines in locations that the Iranians have no awareness of, and Iran could be or would be destroyed in turn. There is an effective deterrence between the two states. But what a nuclear-capable Iran would do is that it would redefine the balance of power in the region. It would limit Israel's maneuverability. It would change the manner in which the rest of the world would deal with Iran, and there's a fear on the Israeli side of what they call abandonment. The West would accept this fait accompli that Iran has the capability, would have to make a deal with it because it's too costly not to have some sort of a functioning relationship with a nuclear-capable state. And the West would move closer towards some sort of reconciliation or at least modus vivendi with Iran, but Israel would not have the same ability, so it would be abandoned in facing Iran. These are, in my assessment, not illegitimate concerns on the Israeli side. Every state is trying to maximize its power. It's not going to view lightly that its maneuverability is going to be challenged. I do question, however, the Israeli tactic in trying to elevate the hysteria to a level in which the only options that the world is looking at are confrontational options rather than other more constructive options. And in that sense, I think the Israeli approach to this has been quite counterproductive. And on that happy note, we'll end it. Thank you all so much.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.